those tuning in via Zoom, when the time comes to enter in the question and answer portion of the event, you can send your questions through the Q&A option on Zoom. People in person can just raise their hands or shout out. I will ask everyone here in person just to be mindful of the microphones in the ceiling. We've learned this recently. They're very powerful microphones, and they're sensitive to rustling bags and crunching lettuce leaves. So we certainly appreciate your awareness of this for all the listeners at home. So we are so incredibly excited to have Dr. Anna DeForest joining us today. Dr. DeForest is an assistant attending physician in the supportive care service at MSK in New York City, Memorial Sloan Kettering. Dr. DeForest has an MD from Columbia University, completed residency training in neurology at Yale, fellowship in palliative care at Mount Sinai, and has an MFA in fiction writing from Brooklyn College. So an MD, MFA is a combination we always love to see in the health humanities. Dr. DeForest's work has appeared in many publications, including Harper's, the Yale Review, and the New England Journal. And the Paris Review published their essay, The World's Greatest, in December of 2020. And this remains for me a seminal piece of writing about COVID. So if you read one thing by them today, I recommend that essay. Dr. DeForest's first novel, A History of Present Illness, was a New York Times Editor's Choice and winner of the Rosenthal Family Foundation Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Novelist Jenny Offel said, the book will haunt you long after you finish it, and added, I would read DeForest on my deathbed. So very high praise. Dr. DeForest's second novel, Our Long Marvelous Dying, is forthcoming from Little Brown in July 2024. We're very excited for that book to come out. And we're so happy that Dr. DeForest can join us today. So I will now turn things over to our 2024 AOA visiting professor, Dr. DeForest.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your patience as we sorted out the technical stuff. Let's do the talk. So the title of my talk, as you can see, is Saying What We Mean. So it should be pretty straightforward. We do this all the time. Yes, try our best from each time we speak to say what we mean, but as I hope you'll soon consider or even believe, is that saying what we mean is harder than we think it is. It's a tall order. Knowing what we mean, sometimes even harder. Has anyone in this room ever heard the saying, getting into the weeds? That's an agricultural metaphor. I'm going to try to make you believe, or at least consider seriously, that whenever we speak, we get into the weeds. And one of the biggest obstacles you face as a doctor may be knowing what you mean, and that's okay. My disclosure slide, I have just one I wish to mention, that today's talk is funded by the AOA. The AOA is a National Medical Honor Society, and I'm grateful that they've given me an opportunity to speak here, but I did want to mention that I'm not a member of the AOA. In fact, I didn't know it existed until the fourth year of medical school when I watched my colleagues bestow this honor upon one another. And when I was a resident at Yale, I found that they did not have a chapter of the AOA, so I was interested to learn why. Well, every organization that sponsors an AOA chapter is responsible for determining criteria for membership. Their data in aggregate shows that the AOA has a diversity problem. Membership for white students is nearly twice as great as that for Asian students and 6 times greater than that for Black students. Discrepancies that hold even after adjusting for relative representation, socioeconomic measures, standardized test scores, and academic achievements. Students from backgrounds with lower incomes than their peers are far less likely to be members of the AOA. In fact, fewer than 20% of AOA members have ever been eligible to receive federal financial aid. Worse still, as the number of marginalized identities a student reports increases, their odds of AOA membership decreases further. For example, a gay Black woman from a low-income family has a less than 6% chance of ever being a member of the AOA, compared to 23.7% for her classmate who is a straight white man who never needed financial aid. It's worth noting because the AOA is important. Alpha Omega Alpha counts 55 Nobel Prize laureates among its membership, and over 75% of medical school deans are members of the AOA. If we acknowledge that AOA membership grants long-reaching access to institutional privilege throughout a doctor's career, and we also acknowledge that the honor is disproportionately granted to white people from wealthy families, it may be reasonable to consider doing what Yale, UCSF, Mount Sinai, WashU, and elsewhere have done, which is suspend their AOA chapters until thorough investigation in this problem is revealed. resolved, etc. That's my disclosure, sorry. Okay, moving on. I'm hoping this talk can be fun, and I'm hoping it can be interactive. The first interaction I would ask for is this: can anyone tell me what is in this picture? Anybody? No physics majors in the room? We all had to take it. Okay, this image is a representation of something known as the double slit experiment. The first version of this happened in 1801, where a young physician who was also, I guess what's called a polyglot, and a Renaissance man who was an Egyptologist, who was a physicist, shined light through these two slits, showing that what happens on the other side of the slits is a wave refraction pattern. This undercut the previous beliefs of none other than Isaac Newton, who felt certain that light was not a wave, but was in fact a particle. In the 1920s, amid the fervor of a burgeoning science called quantum mechanics, Davison and Germer repeated Young's double slit experiment with electrons, confirming de Broglie's hypothesis that electrons behave both as waves and as particles, depending on the conditions of their observation. Such observer-dependent facts were unheard of in physics before that time, and much effort since then has been dedicated to explaining away the mysteries of quantum mechanics without much success. Why am I talking about this? Well, I think this means something really important for us as people. I think it means that some basic facts about our world are practically incomprehensible. The 1920s, as you probably know, also gave us the first iteration of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is an equation that describes the quantifiable limit on the certainty with which a particle's location and momentum can simultaneously be known. In my first novel, A History of Present Illness, the narrator is scolded by a physics professor for considering the metaphoric implications of this permanent quantum uncertainty. None of this is a metaphor, the professor says, and he did. But there were many physicists throughout the 20th century who were deeply concerned about the relationship between quantum mechanics and the meaning of human life and the aspiration of the sciences. Heisenberg, in fact, was among them. He felt clearly and strongly that the revelations of quantum mechanics marked a change in our understanding of reality, a change that required a new use of language. Speaking of wave-particle duality, Heisenberg writes that the two forms complement one another and do not contradict each other, so long as we maintain an awareness that particle and wave are to be understood as mental pictures in the human mind. That is, our understanding can only be a metaphor. He felt that quantum mechanics revealed that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature as exposed to our methods of questioning, articulated, and this part is important and often left out, articulated in the language that we possess. A sidestep, if you will, for a moment. The novelist Cormac McCarthy, widely considered one of the greatest writers in the history of American literature, published one piece of nonfiction in his lifetime, which I encountered while I was reading about Heisenberg's writing on the role of human understanding of physics. The essay is called The Kekulé Problem, and it's about the origins of language. The framing image comes from a historical milestone in another hard science, chemistry. August Kekulé was a German chemist who discovered the structure of benzene in 1865. Kekulé's breakthrough revolutionized organic chemistry, but the reason it interested McCarthy so much is that Kekulé made at the time the astonishing claim that the structure of benzene was revealed to him in a dream. In Kekulé's dream, he saw the Ouroboros, an ancient symbol of a snake eating its own tail. And from that image, he deduced benzene's ring structure. McCarthy was troubled by this and other examples of the potential knowledge contained in parts of our brains to which we do not have access, the biological unconscious. McCarthy highlights that language came late to human history, and yet quickly became so important to us humans that we rapidly physically evolved to accommodate a sudden need to produce with our mouths a large repertoire of noises. He writes that we turned our throats over largely to the manufacture of speech, not without cost, as it turns out. The larynx has moved down in the throat in such a way as to make us a species highly vulnerable to choking on our food, a not uncommon cause of death. It's also left us as the only mammal incapable of swallowing and vocalizing at the same time. McCarthy notes that whenever we reach into ourselves to use our language to describe our states of mind or our beliefs, we venture into Kekulé's dream, the same realm of strange inchoate knowledge. He writes, when you pause to reflect and say, let me see, how can I put this? Your aim is to resurrect an idea from this pool of we know not what and give it a linguistic form so it can be expressed. It is the this that one wishes to put that is representative of this pool of knowledge whose form is so amorphous. If you explain this to someone and they say they don't understand, you may well seize your chin and think some more and come up with another way to put it, or you may not. What I take from McCarthy is that our notion of speaking and knowing are profoundly facile and likely largely confabulatory. Among the most striking experiences of my training as a neurologist have been meeting patients with Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, where thiamine deficiency caused by starvation or profound alcohol use causes patients to lose their ability to create new memories. The hallmark of Wernicke-Korsakoff is confabulation, which means the patients generate elaborate narratives which are mostly untrue to explain whatever data you present them with, to link together into coherent narratives the things they think they should know but do not. One stunning bedside diagnostic test for Wernicke-Korsakoff is known as the string test. You hold your hands up in front of the patient like this, and you ask them, what color is this string? And they'll say, it's pink, or it's red, or it's green with white stripes, which is astonishing, of course, because there is no string. To meet these patients is strange and extraordinary, but what it took me some reflection to realize is this. What part of the brain damage sustained in Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome leads to confabulation? Anybody? Anybody? Neuroanatomy? I'll give you a hint, it's a trick question. There's no part of the brain that is damaged to cause confabulation. It isn't an injury. The system is built this way. The language center chattering away, pretending it knows what it's talking about. In the complex machinery of our brains and minds, we live largely on the surface, identified most of all with our babbling linguistic brain, which, why else would we call it the dominant hemisphere? McCarthy elaborates, we may be able to name any number of discrete facts about the world, but those points are not narrativized, not put into any relational meaning, without some other thing, some human process, which is deep and old. One lost my thought. Strange, etc. Deep and old and strange. McCarthy, at the end of what will turn out to be his final series of novels before his death, writes in the mouth of his speaker, a young genius institutionalized by the name of Felicia Western. In the end, you really can't know. You can't get a hold of the world. You can only draw a picture. Whether it's a bowl on the wall of a cave or a partial differential equation, it's all the same thing. Okay, I'm starting to draw something here. Are you seeing it at all? Maybe a little. There's specificity, and then there's unity. And they overlap and interact, but like a stereogram, like magic eye. Anyone? Magic eye? Yeah, can't see both at the same time. It's flat or it's 3D. But the world is incomplete without the impossible ability to see these two things at the same time. Let me return to Heisenberg. He himself drew a parallel between wave-particle duality and acts of human speech. I'll have to admit that I encountered all of this thinking in a very excellent book, which I recommend to all of you, called The Rigor of Angels by William Eggington. It's a book comparing the work of Heisenberg to the fiction writer Borges, as it reflects on the work of Immanuel Kant. But he said, and this is him referring to Heisenberg, science translates reality into thought. Humans in turn require language in order to think. Language, however, depends on the same limitation that Heisenberg's work shows holds for our knowledge of nature. Language can home in on the world to a highly objective degree where it becomes well-defined and useful for scientists. But when it's so focused and finely honed, language loses its other essential aspect, the one we need in order to be able to think. Specifically, our words lose their ability to have meanings that change depending on their context. Language has different uses in different contexts, sure. Heisenberg breaks it down as language that's static and language that's dynamic. Static language is objective, specific, and well-defined. Dynamic language is ambiguous, flexible, and context-dependent. You may be thinking as you see this that the language doctors attempted to use would only be static. But static language, as we rapidly find in practice, has a number of specific limitations. This is Eggington quoting Heisenberg. What's sacrificed in static description is that infinitely complex association among words and concepts, without which we would lack any sense at all that we've understood anything about the infinite abundance of reality. To put this into a physical analogy, what good would it be to know everything about the thumb if you could know nothing about its relationship to the hand, or knowing everything about the hand, but nothing about its interconnections with the world it reaches out to touch? This is Eggington again. Because of this trade-off, insofar as thinking about the world depends on coordinating both the static and dynamic aspects of language, a complete and exact depiction of reality can never be reached. Oh, thank goodness. Case. I like to keep things recognizable. So this is a case I managed as an intern. The case on the slide, it's like a stem, I'll read it. A 75-year-old woman is admitted to the ICU after a cardiac arrest in her home. Unknown downtime, now intubated, not sedated, with minimal responsiveness, some brainstem reflexes on exam. CT suggests diffuse anoxic brain injury, confirmed with MRI 72 hours after arrest. You are the intern on 28-hour call, and your resident sends you to the bedside at 10 p.m. after her husband asks the nurse, can't we let her go? What's the question going to be? If this is the stem. Any ideas? Like a USMLE, UWorld, QBank? No guesses. Ethics of vent withdrawal? Open-ended question. It's okay, it doesn't matter. This is about vent withdrawal. What happened next? What happened next haunted me seriously for a very long time, and I wrote about it for the New England Journal just after it occurred. I'm going to quote myself verbatim. During my month as an intern in the intensive care unit, I had a patient who was a retired nurse, never sick a day in her life, until she collapsed in her kitchen one morning out of the blue. By day 5 after her arrest, she was missing more than one brainstem reflex, and a senior resident and I were coming on to 28-hour call. Awaiting withdrawal, her sign out said, NTD. Nothing to do. I was 16 hours into the shift when the family was ready to remove the ET tube. I told my senior their wishes and I asked him what to do next. Oh, he said, you just call respiratory and they do it. I placed the order and then a pager went off. A patient with a massive GI bleed was coming up and it was hours before I thought of the nurse again. When I went to the room, she was breathing hard and fast, each breath racking her chest and making an awful, indescribable sound, less like a death rattle than a roar. Her son by her bedside looked sick and pale and stricken. Is it supposed to be like this? Is what he actually asked me. And it was not. I was being haunted about this months later toward the end of the year when I was working nights again with a co-intern and we were lamenting our lives in the ICU. My co-intern was troubled too by the darkness and the futility of our interventions, all the codes and the permanently sick on vents and CVVH. Sure, you can imagine all these things. And he said to me with some frustration, no matter what I did, my patients' families never wanted to withdraw care. Withdraw care. You don't say that, do you? No, someone shake your head no. What's wrong with saying that? Should go without saying that it breaks the childcare doctor's heart to hear anyone say withdraw care. Why? Because no matter what happens, no matter how close to death you get, we never stop caring. We care deeply. There's the deep care we feel as professionals and our obligations, our personal perspectives as human beings in the world, but we still continue to offer routine nursing care, ideally pain and symptom management, all the way up to death, and then after for the families. But my friend's phrase and my awful experience brought me to a startling conclusion. The language we use gives us away. You know what I mean, he said, but I did not know what he meant, and I didn't know that he knew either, because my mind flew right back to that nurse. Although it was never our intention, oh, stop doing that. Although it was never our intention to stop caring about her, as soon as the condition of her body exited the realm of our medical capabilities, it's fair to say we did lose interest. And as she died in that room with her symptoms poorly managed, I think it's fair to say that what we had done, in fact, was withdraw care. Forever after that, I became a collector of medical language. Language is a habit, and as we study it together, we learn who we are, So I would like to try, if you are game right now, to take from the crowd some examples of revealing medical language. Anybody? You've all been on the boards. What do you hear? Ever heard something funny, strange?
Wheelchair bound?
Wheelchair bound.
Surgerize.
Surgerize. Oh, that's a really good one.
The patient was surgerized on the table.
I once heard the word survive used as a verb. We will survive him, which meant prolong his life with life support.
It's after you consent him.
That's right. This is not on the list that I'm about to get to, but there is a word for when you turn verbs into nouns and nouns into verbs and vice versa. It's a really interesting formulation. Surgerize is a new one to me, and thank you. Anybody else?
The cirrhotic.
Cirrhotic. Yeah, any disease first language. That the person is actually completely removed from that formulation, so that's particularly rough.
Suspicious, like suspicious for a certain thing. Like
That's a good one. There's a lot of disbelief language, and we'll talk about that more later. But suspicion is also a word that to regular people means one thing and to doctors means something else. Anybody else?
Unreliable historian.
An unreliable historian. Poor historian is another common formulation. What is a historian?
It's telling a history, telling a story.
No, the historian is the person who takes the history. That's what I tell my trainees when they tell me they've encountered a poor historian. I tell them, me too. Okay, I have a big word cloud of these things I've collected over the years. He's a fighter. They're very reasonable. I like this one. What does reasonable mean in a medical context? Ben's laughing. What does it mean?
Obedient.
Obedient, compliant, aligned with the goals of the hospital. Okay. Refuse. Why do patients refuse? Who knows? They're just mean. Pulling the plug, that's a euphemism. Withdrawing care, I already mentioned, I'm a big fan of. There's some pretty hateful phrases in here. I recently got interested in lovely in a medical context. Have you heard this word? Lovely patient, lovely family. What does it mean? Some of you are thinking it's not a bad word. But what I'm doing here is interrogating it a little bit. It's a metaphor. What are lovely patients? Well, they're usually compliant. But most of all, lovely patients make us feel good about ourselves. That's what lovely patients do. Reasonable, lovely patients, more than anyone. Anything else jumping out of the word cloud people are interested in or want to explore more? We'll hit some of these in the further rundown.
I don't know about explore more, but soft code has always been funny to me in the ICU, just in general, because there's no such thing. I mean,
There's not. There's not. So soft code is a euphemism for when we're actually going to violate the patient or family's autonomy by refusing to do an intervention we decided is futile without trying to get them to agree to our perspective.
Curious about loved one.
Loved one. What is a loved one?
Someone who's significant to the patient.
A loved one, I think, to frame it pejoratively, is someone who's present in the room and the medical team doesn't know who they are. That's what a loved one is. A person of unknown relationship to the family. So I don't like it because it's vague, but one of my mentors, who's a long-term APRN who's worked in many different hospice settings, hates the phrase loved one because she says we shouldn't assume that people love their families, which I think is fair. Well, there are all kinds of relationships that show up at the bedside. Just ask what they are. No euphemisms. Anything else? Yeah, are people still saying rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? I would love to know. I don't spend as much time in the ICU as I used to. No one's ever heard that. Do you know what it means? It's like a more elaborate way of just saying circling the drain. Like we're just futzing around, but we know that nothing we do now matters. We're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. I'd love to hear more like regional extended metaphors, if any come to mind. You can shout them out at any time. Okay, So when I look at the language in these different ways, because of my background as an English teacher, I sometimes think that perhaps if we assembled a number of buckets, we could sort out everything that we've heard and come to a deeper understanding of what it means. So here I've provided some definitions straight from the English department. All of these things sort of come from a study that's called rhetoric. Rhetoric, as Plato will remind us, is the art of ruling the minds of men. That's a bit intense, but what it suggests is that when we use rhetoric intentionally, the purpose of it is to change the way that other people feel. Okay, so some of the words and phrases that stand out to us in medical settings, as I mentioned before, are euphemisms. Euphemism is a rhetorical form where you take something unpleasant. Oh, the software's driving me nuts. You take something unpleasant or harsh or stigmatized and use a softening phrase to make it more palatable. I'm a healthcare doctor, and death is one of the most euphemized conditions in the world. You could say a lot about why that's the case, but basically death is unpleasant, and to mention it, we prefer to soften it. In the hospital, euphemisms for death most often passed. Oh, she passed. Oh, starting to transition means he's about to die. Passed means he did die. Expired, is anyone still saying that? Moving on. Transferred to the morgue. Kick the bucket off the farm. That's an agricultural metaphor. Okay, so death is stigmatized and we need to dress it up. And on the doctor's side, a lot of the times we say that we do this for families. It's the families who can't hear the word die, death, etc. But then we say these words amongst ourselves all the time in the workroom and on rounds. So all I hear from that is that we don't like to admit it, but our work is harsh even to us. And sometimes we feel we need to soften it. I do encourage my fellows to always use the word death at least once, because language is a habit. And so you don't learn what you don't say. Okay. When it comes to euphemism, this is a place where some people who don't like people like me, people who don't like pedants or the word police, start to suggest that all careful language is euphemism, that we get fussy, to be politically oppressive, that this is virtue signaling or political correctness. But if you dig in here at all, you can find really fast many terrible examples of the euphemism treadmill in medicine. For example, who here knows that moron, idiot, and mongoloid are all medical terms for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? Because intellectual disability is stigmatized, to some extent, whatever terms we use to describe it will come to accrue stigma. So what do we do? Well, the linguist John McWhorter says that all language for stigmatized topics accrues baggage over time. So the best thing to do is change the language, acknowledge the stigma, and change the language. He says euphemisms are like underwear, best changed frequently. Okay, next I have dysphemism. This one's funny. Dysphemism is functionally the opposite of euphemism. It's when you use unnecessarily harsh language to describe something. If you ever called a psychiatric hospital a nut house, you were using dysphemism. Any others come to mind? Most of our gallows humor relies on dysphemism. Also, a lot of dysphemisms are euphemisms gone wrong. Think idiot from before, which honestly used to be considered a polite term. Gallows humor, good, bad, indifferent. It cheers us up. Jokes are fun. People are always telling me this. Jokes are fun. But gallows humor is often a signal of unmet emotional needs and moral injury. And studies actually have shown that using Black humor to cope with moral distress makes it worse over time. Not to be a downer, but I love a good joke. Okay, metaphor is next. We all know what metaphor is, a figure of speech that describes something in a non-literal fashion that helps to explain the idea by comparison. A battle with cancer is metaphor, caught between a rock and a hard place, etc. A lot of metaphorical language is culturally situated, so it's important to keep that in mind. Through the lens of language equity, people who are not native speakers or not embedded in the culture will struggle to understand certain kinds of metaphoric language, so be mindful of that. Also, many of you have probably intuited this, but metaphors, the structure of them, and we'll talk about this more later if we have time, impacts the way that you approach a problem and the way that you think about it. So if you describe going through cancer treatment as any kind of battle or war, it may have implications for how the patient feels and the treatment options they see as viable. Jargon. Does anybody know what jargon is? It's on the board, so you do now. Jargon is just the specific language of an in-group. So medical language, the things that we learn to speak in school is jargon. Colloquially, jargon also just means like pretentious language marked by big words and circumlocutions. Why do doctors speak in jargon? Anybody?
It doesn't feel like jargon anymore.
It doesn't feel like jargon anymore. So you used to know how to speak normal, right? And then you were taught to speak jargon. Why? I had a moment when I was in my doctorate class, second year of med school, something like that, and I was just like, hey, what if we just didn't learn to speak in jargon? We all know how to speak English now. Let's just stick with that. And my preceptor scolded me right away. He said kind of what Heisenberg said about static language. He said, we need a specific agreed upon language so that we all know what each other is talking about. And I guess to a certain extent that might be true, but my counterpoint is always this: bilateral lower extremities. What are those? Anyone? Legs, they're legs. So some of it's not needed and a lot of it's kind of coded. It allows us to speak around people in a way that makes us look smart when we're not. It makes it harder for them to understand us, which is sometimes a boon. Okay, that's the legs joke, that's great. Circumlocution is when you use a lot of words to say something you could have said in fewer words. Circumlocution is the primary style of physician communication. Why?
Makes it sound smart when we're not. Makes it sound smart.
It makes it sound smart. I hope so. The big words sometimes help. I don't know if any of us really set off to trick other people, but I think you're right to imply that we may have learned to do this. I don't know if this has been your experience, but for me, when I was a student, what would I do when someone asked me a question to which I did not know the answer? I would begin to speak rapidly and at length about the nearest adjacent topic of which I had knowledge, and with as much detail as I could possibly provide, with the hope that as I spoke, I would either approach the answer to the question I had been asked, or that the person who would ask me would forget what they had asked. So it's an evasive tactic that we learn in training. And again, language is habit, so it never shakes off. Okay, passive voice is interesting and important. Does anyone know what this is? Passive voice is a sentence construction where the object of the sentence appears before the verb and seems to be performing the action. That sounds highly technical, but just think of like a CT was obtained, or antibiotics were given, mistakes were made. What's funny about the passive voice? You're whispering. It hides the actor. And who is the actor it hides? It's the doctor. It hides the doctor. And compare this to the language that we use when we describe patients, which is what we call the active voice. The patient refused the medication. The patient failed the therapy. We don't even use active voice alone to describe patients. We use the active voice with these like crummy pejorative verbs that make it sound like patients are villains who just want to not help us, help them, etc. Passive voice. Okay, homographs is an interesting one. Homographs are basically words that mean one thing in a medical context and another thing in a lay context in such a way that lay people think they understand what you're saying, but they don't. Someone mentioned one, suspicious, to come up earlier. There's a few more that I think are kind of interesting, like an impressive x-ray, a positive test result, usually bad, an occult infection, which is not like spooky or mystical. Helpful? Interesting? Bucketing? Fine. It's about to get better. Rene Descartes. Hear me out quickly because I'm running out of time. Most of us, people who work in Western hard sciences, without thinking about it much at all, have a very Cartesian idea about what thinking is. I alluded to this a little bit in the beginning. For Descartes, he's the guy, you know him, right? I think, therefore I am. The only truest reality is mental content. So he thought that thoughts were super important, and he thought that thoughts were primary and unimpeachable, that he understood that language was necessary to store thoughts and refer to them and communicate them, but he felt that language probably, if anything, would just muddy the waters. Language was not an important part of how we think. Much later in the 1930s, this guy whose name is Benjamin Whorf and one of his buddies, a guy named Edward Sapir, came up with an alternative hypothesis. These two guys were like anthropologists, linguists. They went around the world and met people who spoke different languages and studied the structures of their languages. They actually didn't work together, but they had common ideas and they got stuck together. It's something called the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis, which states as follows: language and thought are completely intertwined and cannot be meaningfully separated. We think in language, and the language that we think in sets the limits of our cognitive categories. He said that language can determine your reality, And most people laughed at him because that would be a very messy situation in terms of how you would study things if you don't even have mental constructs to rely on. Unfortunately, he was right. No one thought so in the 1930s. But in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, a robust body of social scientists began to design some very interesting studies that proved that what Morgan Sapir alluded to is probably to some extent true. I'm going to show you a couple of these studies quickly, not as many as I wanted to, but I think you'll have access to my slides. This is the first one I ever encountered. Russian blues reveal effects of language on color discrimination. So this came out of Stanford in 2007. It was a study cohort split 50-50 between native speakers of English and native speakers of Russian. You maybe never thought about this, but the color spectrum is a spectrum, which means you could cut it up any way that you want. People that speak English usually cut it up like Roy G. Biv style, but in Russian, they actually take the colors light blue and dark blue and segregate them into different color categories so distinct that they don't think of them as being the same color. I once would attempt to pronounce the Russian blues names, but I'm not going to do that today. Then they showed these people a color spectra ranging from light blue to dark blue. And what they found was that speakers of Russian are much better at distinguishing very, very similar but not identical shades of the color blue, in part because we can hypothesize their linguistic domain. This excited me tremendously as I was considering my argument against withdrawal care, because one of the main points I get when I present that argument is people ask me, what else should I call it? You want to guess what I tell them? Based on my interest in how we break down color spectrum? I tell them to call it what it is. Because it can mean 1,000 different things, right? Is it bed withdrawal? Is it stopping dialysis? Is it medical aid in dying? Like, what is the thing that we're going to do? The more words you have for the procedures involved in something like withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy, the better you're going to distinguish the differences, and which have important implications for how we care for our patients. Okay, so words determine what we can see is what I just showed you. Now I'm going to tell you that words determine who we blame. This is two studies sort of coupled together. In the first, the cohort, again from Stanford, compares speakers of Japanese to speakers of English. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but if you're skiing as an English speaker and you fall down and your arm breaks, how do you describe what happened? Ow. Ow. I broke my arm, is what you say. I broke my arm. Why would you do such a thing? In many other languages, including, I think, conventional Japanese, they tend to frame accidents in the passive voice. The arm was broken. Does it matter? Yes. When accidents are described using agentive language, I'm going to show you this long list. I don't know if you can read that well, but what you'll see if you notice is that in the column labeled agentive, what you see is what we've described previously as active voice. And in the other column, you see the non-agentive language, which is passive voice. He wore out the shoe, he shrunk the shirt, he ignited the grill. This guy's a mess. Or the non-agentive versions. And when accidents are described non-agentively, the actor present for the accident is less likely to be remembered by the listener or reader, and less likely to be blamed for what's happened. In another similar study comparing only head-to-head English speakers, an accident involving overturning a candelabra at a fine dining restaurant is described in the passive and then the active voice. And then what you can see here in this chart is that the x-axis here is describing the outcomes of what the readers are told is an independent assessment of the person's guilt. And you'll notice in the category of mid, the independent assessment rates the person as slightly responsible. When the accident is described with agentive language, it's almost double the amount of the y-axis financial liability in dollars that the person who tipped over the candelabra is assumed to owe the restaurant just based on the sentence construction of the scenarios done. Okay, words determine our place in the world. So this was one of the first and most exciting studies from the new linguistic relativism starting in the 1990s. This came from a guy named Levinson at the Max Planck Institute. He went to Northern Australia where he studied speakers of a few different languages that have the interesting confine that they don't use relative determinations of direction. So relative determinations of direction is like my right hand or my left hand. It's behind the shelf. It's above the car. There's all these different ways we can localize things using left, right, or in reference to other structures in the area. They don't do any of that. They localize everything using the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. My north hand and my south hand. Children speak this language. Levinson described asking one of the people he knew there where to find the frozen fish in a grocery store 49 kilometers away, and the man gestured to the northwest. assuming that Levinson would go into the store, orient himself north-south, and walk to the northwestern corner where he could find the fish in the freezer. Okay, this is Levinson. And if you don't believe me all the way that the words we use determine the structure of our reality, believe me this much. It is self-evident that certain linguistic distinctions force attention to certain properties of the world. I promised you I'd prove to you that metaphors affect our reasoning. And this was also studied again from the Stanford group. They used a description of crime in a city. I put the text here just so you can see how simple it is. People were given a report about increasing crime rates in a city and asked to propose a solution. For half, crime was described as a beast preying on the city, and for the other half as a virus infecting the city. Now look at this graph. The two different possible solutions, and I think this was a qualitative analysis, so that the people really came up with this on their own, and then their answers were coded as either being related to enforcement, just like more policing, more incarceration, et cetera, or related to reform, coming up with like public health type initiatives that could address the problem at the root cause. You can see when crime was described as a beast, the proportion of people who reached for enforcement over reform is significant, a little less so in the virus. This matters to us because physicians use metaphors a lot. The giant block here is just a number of specific metaphors actually used by oncologists in this study out of Duke and UPMC. I found it very interesting that not only do oncologists use metaphors, they use them in 2/3 of their visits. Doctors who use metaphors are often rated as being better communicators and better explainers than doctors who don't. In this study, which was limited to native English speakers for the entire population, so there might be an imaginary. But interestingly, they stratified the domain of the metaphors, and most of them come from 4 categories: agricultural, militaristic, mechanical, or sports. I had one question when I saw this strata. Does one come to anyone's mind? Does anyone want to guess what the gender breakdown of the oncologists in this study is?
Yeah.
The same. Those are boy metaphors. It matters. So I don't know actually the significance of agricultural metaphors, but war metaphors probably damage our patients. This study came from the California group after Bornitsky moved to UCSD, and it does not involve actual patients, but they used a vignette study to see how the impressions people got about the outcomes of cancer treatment in hypothetical scenarios based on using battle versus journey language. And they found that describing illness journey instead of illness battle increased the likelihood that end of life could be peaceful and that the patients would feel less guilt about their failure at treatment. Okay, one last slide about harms in the EMR, just while I'm throwing this stuff in. This is a fantastic study out of Hopkins called Testimonial Injustice, which is about what we were talking about previously, that a lot of our language includes linguistic features suggesting disbelief. This group studied a large selection of actual chart notes from the EMR and flagged them for 3 different kinds of statements of disbelief: evidentials, which is an element, a grammatical element indicating the source of knowledge is someone else, the patient reports. The headache started yesterday. Judgment words, which they included a list of adamant, apparently, claims, insistent states. And then most interestingly for me here is direct quotations being as charted as a linguistic feature of disbelief. Now, some of us were trained, myself included, that using direct quotations is a humanizing measure, letting the patient's own voice exist in the EMR. But we're also well aware of the use of scare quotes and what they mean. It means this is what he said, and I don't believe him. Now, we can talk about what the implication of each is. Is it possible it's the patient's own voice or it's a disbelief marker? But one thing that they found in the Hopkins study is whatever it means, if you're a woman or a Black person, you are much more likely to have direct quotations in your medical record than a white person who's a man. That's kind of a whirlwind, and I feel bad. But I wanted to say briefly on this last slide, just that Rita Sharon teaches that narrative medicine includes 3 movements. Number 1 is attention. Number 2 is representation. And number 3 is affiliation. Paying attention to the words that we use not only changes the way that we relate to other people, but it allows us to examine ourselves for subconscious bias. Representation of our own experiences in language, like journaling, creative writing, creative nonfiction writing, or fiction writing like I do, gives you a great platform for interrogating your own beliefs as they change over time. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much. It's the time for questions.
All right, I think we have time for one question. Does anyone here who's physically present have a question they'd like to ask? And because of the powerful microphones, you can just say it.
Yeah, your last points were reminding me of an observation I read about several years ago, and that was that in describing tumors and especially tumor sizes to patients, doctors tended to describe tumors using ball size, like golf ball, softball, things when talking with male patients, and with female patients, vegetables or fruits. Grapefruit, lemon,
It's
things
very
like that.
funny. And so it's the same physicians presumably. They're like, oh, you're a woman, you'll know about lemons, right? That's funny because when I was looking at the list, what I was calling my dude metaphors, sports and the military and machines, and then agriculture was kind of the outlier. Maybe that's for the ladies.
Or the kitchen.
That's right. Thank you.
All right, I wish we had more time, but thank you so much, Anna, for that. It was just a wonderful talk. One more round of applause. Please join us next week, same time. This is going to be our final medical center hour. So please join us next week, and thank you again for joining us today.